Don't you dare move. The voice cracked through the still morning air like a whip, sharp and desperate. A man named Caleb stood frozen at the edge of his farmyard, his hands clenched into fists as he watched the chaos unravel before him. The wooden fence that bordered the pasture groaned under the weight of a tiny body, a baby goat wedged between the slats, its cries raw and piercing. Struggling and panicked, the animal's fragile legs kicked helplessly, scraping the dirt and grasped in a frantic plea for release. Beside it, tense and unyielding, was Axel, Caleb's German shepherd. The dog's body trembled with energy, fur bristling as he planted himself like a guardian at the fence line. His low growls carried a warning, not at the trapped kid but at anyone who dared to step too close. His golden brown eyes, usually soft and eager, were fierce with something deeper, a mix of fear, loyalty, and defiance. Caleb had raised Axel from a pup, trusted him with livestock and land alike. But in this moment even Caleb felt the weight of his dog's silent command, "Stay back." The farm was quiet, otherwise unnervingly so. The wind that usually rustled through the tall grass seemed to hold its breath. Chickens huddled near the coop, silent, as if they too sensed the tension between man, dog, and the helpless creature pinned against rough timber. Every sound became magnified, the goat's broken bleats, the rhythmic scrape of its hooves, and the deep rumble of Axel's chest vibrating against the earth. Caleb stepped forward, his boots crunching on gravel, and Axel snapped his head toward him, the dog's ears pinned back, his muscles tightening as though he would throw himself against anyone who approached. Caleb stopped cold. It wasn't anger that radiated from Axel, it was fear. He recognized it in the dog's eyes, the fear that if he let anyone touch the baby goat, it would slip further into danger. Axel didn't understand fences or splinters. He only understood life and loss, and in that moment he had chosen his side. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered, his voice carrying a rough edge that betrayed his nerves. He had never seen Axel like this, not even when coyotes lurked at the edges of the fields. The shepherd's loyalty was legendary, but this was something else. Axel's body formed a barrier, as though he'd sworn an oath with his own heartbeat not to abandon the goat until it was safe. The baby goat cried out again, a sound so sharp it cut straight through Caleb's chest. His instinct screamed to rush forward, to pry the fence apart with his bare hands if needed, but Axel's stance stopped him. The dog's eyes flickered between the man and the trapped animal, every muscle quivering with resolve. Caleb could feel it now, the strange weight of trust that hung in the air. Axel wasn't keeping him away. Axel was begging him to help, but only if he understood the urgency. The mid-morning sun climbed higher, its light spilling over the wooden posts, casting long shadows across the pasture. Sweat trickled down Caleb's temple, though the air was still cool. He looked at Axel again, at the way the dog's paws pressed into the earth, claws digging into the soil as if anchoring himself to his duty. This wasn't mere instinct, was something raw, something almost human in its depth. And then, just as Caleb took another careful step, the goat's cry faltered into silence. Its head drooped, its small chest heaving as exhaustion began to take hold. Axel's growl broke, rising into a desperate bark that shattered the stillness of the morning. Caleb's heart lurched. This wasn't just a dog guarding a farm animal. This was a plea for life, a demand that Caleb act before the silence swallowed the fragile heartbeat still clinging to the fence. The moment stretched, taut as a wire, as Caleb locked eyes with his dog. Axel barked again, sharp and urgent, then pressed his muzzle against the goat's side, whining in a voice that carried grief and hope all at once. Caleb had never felt so small on his own land. This wasn't his decision anymore. It was Axel's command, and Caleb, for the first time, realized he had no choice but to follow. The world seemed to narrow down to three figures: the man, the dog, and the trembling kid, pinned in wood and fear. Questions raced through Caleb's mind. How long had the goat been stuck? Could he pull it free without breaking its fragile neck? And why was Axel acting as though the entire weight of life itself hung in the balance? None of those answers came, but the urgency did. He dropped to his knees, gravel biting into his skin, and whispered, "All right, boy, we'll do this your way." Axel's growl softened, his tail lowering, though he never moved from his guard. Caleb reached for the fence, his fingers wrapping around the rough wood, and the silence of the pasture deepened into a suspenseful stillness. Something was about to give either the fence, the goat, or the trust between man and dog. And as Caleb braced himself to pull, he felt the weight of Axel's gaze burning into him, a reminder that failure was not an option. The rescue had begun, but the true test of loyalty, of faith, was only just unfolding. Caleb's hands pressed harder against the rough wooden slats, his palms stinging as splinters bit into his skin. He gritted his teeth, pulling with all his strength, but the fence held stubbornly in place. The baby goat gave a faint kick, its tiny hooves scuffing against the dirt, before sagging again in exhaustion. Axel let out a deep, throaty bark that echoed across the pasture, his voice breaking like a warning shot into the silence. Caleb felt the urgency rising in his chest like a storm cloud pressing down on him. Time was slipping away, and the goat's shallow breaths told him he didn't have long. The German shepherd moved closer, nudging his nose against the kid as though willing it to stay alive. His eyes glistened with a wild, protective desperation, and Caleb felt a chill creep into his spine. This wasn't the loyal farm dog he had known for years, the one who herded sheep with playful discipline or guarded the barn with stoic patience. This was Axel transformed into something primal, something bound by an unshakable vow that Caleb could not ignore. It was as though the dog had claimed the baby goat as his own, refusing to let death take it. "Hold on," Caleb muttered, his voice low, cracking under strain. He braced his boots into the soil, feeling it shift beneath him, and pulled again with a grunt that wrenched through his body. The fence creaked, a hollow groan echoing through the posts, but it refused to break. Axel barked again, circling once before planting himself firmly between Caleb's arms and the trapped goat, his body rigid, his breath sharp and rapid. It was as though he feared Caleb's clumsy strength might do more harm than good. Frustration burned hot in Caleb's chest. He slammed his fist against the wood, the sound ringing like a dull drumbeat through the quiet air. The kid bleated weakly, its voice faint, and Caleb's stomach twisted. He knew he was running out of options. If he pushed too hard, he could crush the fragile bones beneath the goat's skin. If he hesitated, the animal might not have the strength to endure. Axel growled softly, pacing with agitation, then pressed his muzzle once more against the baby. Goat sighed, licking its fur in a desperate attempt to soothe it. Then, suddenly, Caleb noticed something he hadn't before: the way the goat's body wasn't just stuck, but twisted. Its front leg had slipped between two slats, bent at an unnatural angle. The more it struggled, the deeper the wood dug into its thin flesh. Caleb's pulse quickened as realization sank in. Freeing the goat wasn't about breaking the fence, it was about precision, careful movement, and timing. He would need Axel's trust more than ever. He took a slow breath, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Easy, boy. I see it now." Axel's ears twitched, his eyes flicking from the goat to Caleb. The shepherd didn't move, but his growls softened into low, steady rumbles that vibrated through the soil. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection either. Caleb reached carefully, fingers brushing the goat's trembling body. Axel's nose darted down, pressing alongside his hand, as though guiding him, as though to say, "Here, not there." The air was thick with tension. Sweat slid down Caleb's face, dripping into the earth, as his fingers worked carefully to adjust the goat's position. The kid let out a sharp cry, its pain searing through the air, and Axel's bark exploded, sharp and frantic, nearly making Caleb pull back in panic. But he held steady, gritting his teeth, whispering calming words not just for the goat, but for the dog who hovered like a shadow at his side. And then came the twist and unexpected sound from beyond the field. Caleb froze, his head snapping, up toward the tree line that bordered the pasture. A rustle, faint but deliberate, drifted from the brush. Axel stiffened immediately, his body whipping around toward the noise, a guttural growl rising from his chest. For a moment, the dog was torn between the helpless goat still gasping in the fence and the unseen threat creeping near. Caleb's heart pounded as he scanned the edges of the woods, the unease clawing at his nerves. Predators weren't strangers here. Coyotes, sometimes even mountain lions, prowled when the air grew heavy with desperation. "Stay with me, Axel," Caleb whispered urgently, though he knew the dog was fighting instincts older than trust. The shepherd barked, low and savage, staring into the trees. The goat whimpered, and Caleb felt the impossible weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting wood and splinters anymore, he was fighting time, fighting danger, fighting against the very wilderness that threatened to close in around them. The noise in the trees grew louder, snapping twigs beneath heavy paws. Caleb's stomach clenched. His mind raced. If he left the goat trapped, it wouldn't stand a chance. But if Axel left its side, if the dog chose to confront whatever stirred in the shadows, Caleb would be alone in the struggle, and the goat's fragile life would teeter even closer to the edge. Axel let out a final bark that shattered the silence, his body leaning forward, ready to spring. Caleb grabbed his collar instinctively, his knuckles white against the thick fur. "No," he hissed, his voice breaking. "Not yet." The dog's chest heaved, every muscle straining, but his eyes flicked once more toward the goat. For a heartbeat, everything hung in fragile balance: the trapped kid, the desperate man, the vigilant dog, and the unseen threat waiting just beyond the pasture. The moment stretched into something unbearable. Caleb felt the pulse of the earth beneath his knees, the faint trembling of the goat's body under his hand, and the hot, unyielding power of Axel pressing against his grip. It was as though the entire world was watching, holding its breath, to see which bond would break first. And just then, from the shadowed tree line, a low, echoing howl pierced the air. The sound rippled through the pasture like a wave, pulling every last shred of calm into silence. Axel's body stiffened, his growl deepening into something primal. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The goat was still trapped, the fence unbroken, and the predators had come closer. The story was no longer about just saving a kid stuck in wood. It had become something far greater, test of loyalty, survival, and whether man and dog together could hold back the darkness pressing in from the wild. Caleb's hands trembled as he pried at the weathered fence, splinters biting into his skin. Axel stayed rooted at his side, pressing his nose against the goat's trembling flank, as if his touch alone could keep the tiny creature tethered to life. The baby goat's weak cries had softened to shallow gasps, each one sounding more fragile than the last. Caleb felt panic claw at his chest. He had wrestled with broken gates in storms and dragged stubborn cattle from mud, but this was different. A childlike fragility hung in the air, and one wrong move could shatter it all. The wood groaned under Caleb's weight, but it barely budged. He braced his boots against the earth, his shoulders straining as he pulled again. Nothing, he cursed. Under his breath, sweat stinging his eyes, Axel barked sharply at the sound, as though rebuking him for despair, then shoved his muzzle harder against the goat's side. The dog wasn't asking anymore, he was demanding. Caleb's jaw clenched. He knew he had to be careful, but every second wasted was a second stolen from the goat's fragile heartbeat. The silence of the farm deepened until even the wind seemed to vanish, leaving only the ragged rhythm of breathing the goat's and Axel's. Caleb tried the fence again, forcing his hands beneath the tight slats, when a sound cut through the air. A low, guttural bleat echoed from beyond the pasture, strong and desperate. Caleb's head shot up, his eyes scanning the tree line. There, half hidden in the shadows, stood a nanny goat. Her eyes were wide with panic, her body rigid as she let out another call that made the trapped kid's ears twitch feebly. Axel reacted. Instantly, he turned from the trapped goat and barked back at the mother, sharp and deliberate, as though delivering news across the distance. The nanny bleated again, stepping closer to the fence line, her hooves crunching against the dry grass. Caleb's heart twisted at the sight. The mother had been searching, calling, waiting, and now she stood watching, powerless, as her child teetered between rescue and loss. The moment of reunion struck Caleb harder than he expected. He had thought only of the baby's suffering, of Axel's strange devotion, but now he saw the larger picture. A mother fighting to reach her child, a dog refusing to leave until that bond was restored. The weight of it pressed down on him, demanding more than muscle. It demanded that he not fail. With renewed determination, Caleb yanked at the fence again. The slats creaked, dust falling in thin streams, but the wood held stubbornly. Frustration flared hot in his chest. Axel let out a frustrated bark and pawed at the ground, claws scraping furrows into the dirt. Caleb wanted to roar with the same desperation, but he bit it down. His anger wouldn't save the goat-only precision, would he? Shifted, pressing his knee against one of the posts for leverage. This time, when he pulled, he felt the wood shift, just barely. His pulse surged. "Come on," he hissed through clenched teeth, throwing every ounce of strength into the effort. The fence groaned louder, bending, stretching, until the gap widened enough for the goat's small body to shift. Axel barked triumphantly, then nudged the kid again, encouraging it to wriggle free. But just as hope surged, disaster struck. The goat's tiny leg twisted awkwardly, snagged on a splintered edge. The fragile body jerked in panic, the kid crying out in renewed agony. Caleb froze, terrified that forcing it further would break the bone. Axel whined, pressing harder against the kid as though urging it to push, but the goat only cried louder, the sound raw and heartbreaking. Caleb's heart dropped. He had made it worse. The nanny on the other side bleated frantically, pacing back and forth, her cries echoing like a dirge across the silent farm. Axel's bark shifted to a whimper, his head darting between Caleb and the trapped kid, his eyes blazing with urgency. Caleb pressed his forehead against the fence, his breath harsh and uneven. He was so close, yet somehow further than ever. For the first time, doubt seeped in. What if the goat couldn't be freed? What if the leg gave way before he found a solution? The weight of failure pressed against his shoulders like the very posts of the fence he was battling. But then Axel did something unexpected. He pressed his body against Caleb, just for a heartbeat, as if reminding him they were in this together. Then he returned to the goat, licking its trembling ear with a tenderness that stopped Caleb's breath. In that instant, Caleb saw what he had missed. This wasn't just about strength, it was about trust, patience, and care. He had been trying to tear the fence apart with brute force, but Axel's every action had been measured, gentle, deliberate. Caleb lifted his hands from the wood, steadied his breathing, and reached carefully for the kid's fragile leg. He didn't pull hard. Instead, he angled the splintered wood aside with slow precision, easing the goat's limb free a fraction. At a time, the kid bleated softly, a sound of pain but also of release. Axel whined low, almost like encouragement, his eyes locked on Caleb's every move. The fence groaned once more, bending reluctantly beneath Caleb's steady pressure. And then suddenly the goat slipped forward, its body collapsing into Axel's waiting pause. Caleb exhaled in a shuddering rush, his arms shaking from the effort. Axel licked the baby's face, nudging it upright while the nanny goat cried from the field's edge, her voice breaking with desperate urgency. But the kid was weak, its legs trembling as it struggled to stand. Relief flickered, but it was far from over. Something told Caleb that the fight for life had only just begun. Would the goat survive long enough to return to its mother, or had the fence stolen too much from its fragile body? Caleb's hands strained against the fence, the rough wood biting into his palms as he tried to pry the slats apart. Every movement sent a jolt through the fragile body of the baby goat, its thin bleats breaking into weak gasps. Axel circled close, his nose pressing against the kid's trembling side, whining as though urging Caleb to hurry. The dog's eyes burned with a frantic intensity, each glance back at his master a wordless plea. Caleb could feel the weight of that gaze, the trust it carried, and it made his chest ache at last. With a groan, the wood gave way just enough for the goat's shoulder to slip through. Caleb reached, heart pounding, fingers brushing soft fern. Then, a sudden crack split the silence. One of the fence posts snapped, toppling forward with a violent jolt that sent a cascade of splinters flying. The goat shrieked in terror, thrashing harder than before, wedged now at a sharper angle. Caleb stumbled back, his arms cut with fresh scratches, and Axel barked furiously, lunging at the broken post as if sheer force could undo what had just happened. For a heartbeat, Caleb froze, the realization settling in that the rescue had just they've grown far more dangerous. The goat's cries faltered again, its little chest heaving in short, panicked bursts. Axel pressed closer, whining so sharply it sounded like grief, pawing at the ground near the trapped animal. Caleb's throat tightened. He had seen animals die before, but never under the eyes of a dog who seemed willing to fight the whole world for one small life. The twist of fear surged into Caleb's gut, but beneath it came something else: determination. He wiped the sweat and blood from his hands, lowered himself once more, and locked eyes with Axel. "We're not losing it," he muttered, voice hoarse but steady. The German shepherd's growls softened, his body trembling with a fragile kind of hope. And as Caleb reached again for the fence, the air around them seemed to pulse with one truth. This fight wasn't just about a goat, it was about proving that loyalty, even against impossible odds, could hold the line between life and loss. Caleb gritted his teeth, his hands trembling as he pulled at the fence again, ignoring the sting of splinters biting into his skin. The baby goat's cries had grown faint, each sound weaker than the last, and for one terrifying moment, he thought it might already be too late. Axel's body pressed against him, the dog's bark breaking into desperate whines, his breath hot and frantic against the air. Caleb felt the pounding of his own heart in his ears, every beat urging him to move faster, to dig deeper, to not let this fragile life slip through while he still had strength left in him. The broken post leaned precariously, pressing harder against the kid's narrow frame. Caleb slid his shoulder under it, straining with every ounce of power he had, his muscles burning as he forced the wood upright. The fence creaked, heavy and unyielding, but finally lifted just enough to ease the pressure. Axel seized the moment, nosing the goat gently, encouraging it forward. With one last heave, Caleb pulled, and the little body slipped free, collapsing into the dirt with a soft thud. For an instant, silence fell. Then the goat coughed, a weak, rattling sound, and its legs twitched as it tried to rise. Axel let out a sharp bark, not of warning this time but of sheer relief. His tail thumped once against the ground, and he pressed his muzzle against the kid's neck as if to reassure himself it was real, that the creature was still alive. Caleb sank back onto the earth, chest heaving, sweat mixing with blood on his forearms. He watched the dog hover over the goat with a tenderness that seemed to defy the world's harsh edges. The kid staggered, legs trembling as though they might give way beneath its tiny frame. But Axel stayed close, nudging softly until the goat managed to stand, wobbling unsteadily before leaning into the shepherd's side. The sight struck Caleb harder than he expected. A dog who could have walked away, who could have chosen his own comfort, had stood guard, had fought with heart and soul for something smaller, weaker, utterly defenseless. Caleb reached out, his hand brushing Axel's fur, feeling the heat of his body still thrumming with tension. "You did it, boy," he whispered, voice catching. Axel glanced at him briefly, eyes gleaming, then turned back to the goat as though unwilling to take credit, unwilling to break his vigil. In that moment, Caleb understood something he hadn't before. Loyalty wasn't just about obedience or trust. It was about a kind of courage that asks for nothing in return. The sun was higher now, its golden light spilling across the pasture, warming the damp earth. The goat stumbled again but stayed upright, bleating softly, its voice stronger than before. Axel walked beside it, steady and protective, as if promising it would never be alone again. Caleb rose slowly, brushing dirt from his jeans, but he didn't call the dog away. Some bonds, he realized, were too sacred to interrupt as he stood there, watching his shepherd guide the fragile creature back toward the safety of the pasture. Caleb felt a shift deep inside him. The world often demanded strength in loud, unyielding ways. But here was proof that strength could also be quiet, steadfast, and selfless. A lesson carried not in words but in the watchful eyes of a dog who refused to leave until hope had returned. The fence still leaned broken, the field still bore scars of the struggle, yet what remained was something far greater, a reminder that even in moments where life teeters on the edge, loyalty and love can tip the balance back toward survival. Caleb would never forget the sight of Axel, head bowed gently beside the trembling goat, their shadows stretching together across the morning light. It was not just a rescue, it was a promise etched into the soil of his farm that no life, however small, would be left to fight alone.